All right, good evening. How is everybody on this very hot uh, later July day? I was just coming in from watering my garden here, and because it is quite warm, and there will be a lot of talk about gardening tonight and changes in the land at Beechwood because at least a part of its history here in the past 300 years, Beechwood had a pretty substantial agricultural impact on the landscape, which we still see and feel to this day. There was a very large public garden there starting in the 1920s into the 40s for the folks that worked on there. So we'll talk a good bit about that. Not sure how many of you know this, but Beechwood also during World War I and World War II contributed to the war effort by growing large numbers of tomatoes and even had a cannery on site that they sent to troops overseas and all sorts of really cool stuff that when you go back and sort of think about how did we get from a point in the past to where we are with how Beechwood looks and feels and what we experience today. It's really interesting to me when you think about this and then look through the landscape, you can see evidence of all of these changes over time. I mean, it is very evident if you know what you're looking for and you begin to really look for all of these particulars here. So I'm going to share my screen for everybody and pull up my PowerPoint, and then we will get going here. So, all right. A few other folks just joining us here. So I'll get the slideshow going. All right, there we go. So, like I mentioned, we obviously know this particular property. This is where my office is, even though I live in Butler, Pennsylvania, Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve. Even the name itself has its roots in the legacy as Beechwood being an agricultural farm for a what we would call today a gentleman farmer, William Flynn. The Route 8 that goes through our area here, right past Beechwood. I take it every day when I'm going down to work there. Is named after this gentleman who, bought the property and essentially turned it into a gentleman farm that actually had a really important impact on Pittsburgh's agriculture over time. So if you are really familiar with Beechwood and you're familiar with this scene here, this is our main building connected to our barn. You can see my office there to the far left, just a little snippet there of the education building here, right? This is very, very different, obviously, what we would have seen really in the past, say, 170 plus years, right? So this landscape has changed pretty substantially, right? Here is a relatively recent picture from our main office, what used to be my office when I came to Beechwood 13 years ago, looking out from the main house or office and store, which is all three there, looking upon the meadow there. And it's interesting when we took this picture, I was looking and kind of contemplating all of the different aspects that you see here, right? So if you look in the sort of the bottom right of this particular picture, you will see an old rusty, essentially plow. I do not know if that has any provenance to this property. I know a lot of people, like the old farmers throw that stuff away and people use it for, art or displays or whatnot. But that had a big impact on our property here over the past, say, 150 years, right? But even looking at how this meadow is currently managed today, and you see a blue spruce, which is not native in this particular area, and a number of other species that you maybe can't see there that aren't native. This is a vastly, vastly different landscape than you would have experienced 300 years ago. So I am actually, even though I do a lot with birds and nature and everything else, by academic training, I'm actually, if you don't know me, I'm a historian. I went to both Pitt and Slippery Rock for history. I taught college history for about 5 years before I came to Audubon. And I've always had a very strong interest in environmental history, right? So I always like to go through, our forests, and my background is in the French and Indian War period, generally speaking. And I would always think to myself, wonder what it was like, the area that this Western Pennsylvania that we call today, what was then called the Ohio country, What was it like when George Washington was 21 years old, tramping through the woods here? And how much difference do we have in this region? And of course, Beechwood, would he have recognized this? Would the Native Americans recognize this, right? And they would, I think, be shocked if they would see the landscape as it is today, right? So this particular lecture I developed is based on a book that I read when I was in graduate school by really, in some ways, considered one of the fathers or grandfathers of what we today call environmental history. So this gentleman, William Cronon, I can't remember if he taught at Harvard or Tufts or somewhere up in that particular area in New England. And it's called, just like this particular program, is called Changes in the Land. And it's Indians, colonists in the ecology of New England. And essentially, again, doing the same thing that we're going to do tonight about Beechwood, but looking at New England and how these ecosystems were radically altered and changed over time to what we now see and experience today. And essentially, I think a good way to think about this is imagine if we were on a spaceship, right? And we went to some alien planet and experienced that. That would be really what a lot of these people 300, even 100 years ago would be seeing if they came to Beechwood from what they had experienced. I mean, Mr. Cronin isn't alive anymore, so I get no royalties from pushing this book. But even though it is an academic book, I highly recommend it because it'll get you thinking about whether where you live, it's your property, or if you have a farm, or if you live in the city, how much humans have altered ecosystems, both intentionally, but really unintentionally. And I think that's the biggest thing, unintentionally, with not any ill will or, we're going to destroy the environment, things that we just didn't know have really altered the world and ecosystems around us. So we're going to talk about that and sort of referencing this book, but this is a really, really great read. So I would always preface this when I would get into my history lectures, but it makes sense here, and we're thinking with Beechwood squarely in our point of reference when we ask this, right? So how did things get to be this way, right? Um, that could be a whole host of things when we talk about Beechwood, right? The ecosystems themselves, animals that used to be there, or animals that were never there until or insects or plants relatively recent, right? How did we get the Beechwood that we know on July 24th, 2025, right? How did that come to be? Well, when you contemplate this over a 300-year time frame, which we're going to do, it has a very strong, um, I would say, causal connections to what humans have done interacting with the ecosystem, right? There's all of these, and this as a historian bothers me that, Native Americans were like these proto-hippie tree huggers that, they didn't impact the land at all. And they were like, modern day Greenpeace environmentalists. And quite honestly, that is the furthest thing from the truth. They lived off the land. They interacted with ecosystems much greater than I think a lot of people in the modern world really realize. So Beechwood was, while most likely, impacted far less than it is today or has been over the last, say, 200 years. Native Americans had a very large impact over time on the landscape that is Beechwood. And quite honestly, one of the biggest ones are the main trees that we would have found 300 years ago. So let's go back in time, and I'm showing my age here. When I would do this in college, I'd say, if you ever watch Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox and he gets in a DeLorean, you're getting older when kids go, "What's a DeLorean?" So I'm showing that I'm almost 50, and I have to kind of rephrase that particular point of reference here. But let's say we could instantly get in a time machine and drop back to July 24th, 1725. What would we have seen if we landed right there at Beechwood, right? Well, one of the first things you would notice is that the forest itself that would have completely engulfed the 134 acres that is Beechwood today would have been dominated by what we call the oak hickory forest type, right? And that is probably, when we talk about oaks, right? Oaks are technically the predominant forest tree that we have here in Western Pennsylvania, and you would have found, say, 300 years ago, right? What is fascinating about this is left to its own devices, that's not naturally what our forests want to turn into here in Western Pennsylvania and other parts here in Eastern North America, right? They will be taken over by specific forest trees that are shade intolerant, things like black cherry and red maple that we see today. And so we think 300 years ago, when you would have experienced 90% of that forest being white oak, that is a legacy potentially of Native American fire practices that long predated European settlement. We're talking about Native Americans burning vast amounts of our forests, right? And a lot of people, when they hear that, they go, oh, that's terrible. It's actually not. It is showing humans working with the environment on purpose to create something that benefits themselves, right? So Beechwood's past legacy of forest, farmland, intensive livestock grazing, landscaping, invasive species that have arrived over the last 200 plus years, and more recently, right, nature conservation practices greatly impact today's habitats that when you walk those trails around Beechwood, you're going to observe. So you're looking at a window into the past when you're at Beechwood, right? And again, just to reiterate, obviously a very, very different environment 300 years ago. It would be almost unrecognizable to what we experience today. So there's a lot here. I'm just going to sort of essentially, summarize what you see here. But to be very scientific about it, what you would have seen in 1723, 17, it should be 25. I didn't update it because I did this 2 years ago. But essentially what's called a mixed mesophytic forest. That is a fancy word for essentially saying while it was dominated, right, by oaks, it was one of the most biologically diverse temperate forest regions on planet Earth. The Appalachians prior to European settlement had so much diversity in that temperate region. We still don't know what we have lost from that in the past, say, 400 years. And that includes in Western Pennsylvania, right? When humans, particularly Europeans, and then the folks that came from all over the world afterwards, they really changed this particular forest association by cutting and creating livestock grazing, which we'll see. So you see a lot of unusually diverse tree flora, as well as all sorts of other understory trees and shrubs, and also things like spring ephemerals and other plants that evolved to adapt to a forested setting, right? Um, when we look at the history, so how do we know what was potentially there? You know, you can imagine I'm an exciting guy on a Friday night because sometimes I read things about what's called witness trees, which are surveys that when after the American Revolution, when they were starting to break up this area in Western PA into farm and farmland, essentially, they would leave very large white oaks as property markers. And those are what's known as witness trees because they survive 200 plus years after the fact. And we see in some of these remnant forest surveys that once again, white oak was by far the most dominant tree by a large margin. And that continued really into, I'd say, the 1940s, 30s, 40s, right? When some of our forests began to grow back, white oak was still by far dominant. You look at old pictures of North Park from the 1930s when it first opened, and other areas in Western PA going back into the 1880s. I have pictures of Economy where the Harmonists lived going back to 1860s, and you see white oak dominates on the landscape there, right? So imagine these massive white oaks, some of them 150 to 175 feet tall, were a huge part of what you would have found there at Beechwood. We do know then that black oak was the second most abundant species found within these forests, followed by various hickory species like shagbark hickory and mockernut hickory, both of which we find in this forest type at Todd Nature Reserve, in some parts there at Beechwood where the forest had been preserved over time. You would have found small stands of American chestnut, black birch, black locust, flowering dogwood, along with spicebush, right, would have predominantly covered the understory of this white oak dominated forest. Then you have things like tulip tree, which we still find today, very large specimens actually at Beechwood, which is a really, really ancient tree. A tree that shows of southern provenance because it is a tree that has been slowly moving since the end of the Ice Age northwards as our climate warms. Then you get things like American beech, right? Where Beechwood is named after. I always ask you or ask people that, go to Beechwood, how many of you have ever actually seen any beeches at Beechwood? You gotta really look hard. There's only one spot in 134 acres that I know where maybe three beech trees grow, but they were there. They were clearly there when it was named by William Flynn, right? And it was probably a big component of Beechwood's forest, especially headed towards um, Hart Run Road. So then you have things like sugar maple, right? Where we're in there. So this is a very, even though it's dominated by oaks and hickories, this still has a lot of diversity of trees. The valley bottoms, right? So if you go in Spring Hollow out of our pond, there's a little spring stream that runs down into Little Pine Creek. That is what we call a bottomland or wetland ecosystem. So you would have seen these being dominated by numerous small stable streams. And I can almost guarantee you some parts of Beechwood 300 years ago had large stands of hemlock too. Because hemlock, hence the term Pine Creek, likes shaded, cooler areas, just like Todd Nature Reserve does. So they also would have been found on the property as well. Okay? So let's get to the humans that interacted at this time 300 years ago with the landscape. And that would have been Native Americans. Now, you have to understand something historically when we talk about this. So roughly 300 years ago, in 1725, this area in what is now Western Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. So that was what was known generically at that time as the Ohio country. Ohio is an Iroquoian word that just means beautiful. So the Ohio River means the beautiful river. That's what the French called it. Native Americans, we know for a fact, have lived off and on in Western Pennsylvania for at least 23,000 years. We're a blip on the screen when you really think about this, right? And the forest, or lack thereof, because the Ice Age was still going on, a big portion of that, things would have changed many of the times due to climate change and all sorts of other things there, right? But Native Americans had been here for a long time. That's a very long-winded way of saying in 1725, Native Americans were just beginning to return to Western Pennsylvania because it had been depopulated of humans, of Native Americans. And it's still controversial why, but the best up-to-date evidence seems to be other Native Americans, the Iroquoian people, the Six Great Nations, depopulated a lot of these folks to gain access to the resources in here. So these folks, these Native Americans that were coming to Western PA 300 years ago were refugees because of Pennsylvania, New York's, and Virginia's and New Jersey's policies toward them, right? So they would have found an abundance of resources that they would not have found right back where they lived. So this is one that when I first started grad school is very controversial, and now it's really considered basically, yes, this is exactly why we see the forests we did. We have very, very strong evidence now, not just in the historical record, but in basically tree rings and other records found in areas where you have trees that are still alive today that coincided when the Native Americans dominated the landscape. And we know Native Americans used fire on mass scale to create openings for not just really agriculture, but to clear forests primarily of understory vegetation. And this is reflected in early descriptions of the forest structure, right? Now, don't think of this like a massive five-alarm fire where it's raging through the canopy. This is a relatively low intensity understory burning leaves, and they would now until roughly about, say, November, sometimes even December, if it was a warm early winter, they would burn the leaf litter and it would burn in a relatively low intensity fire that would keep the understory open, right? We know that as a fact now. We also know that when you have large forests, natural fire from lightning And I just read a article yesterday that says worldwide, lightning kills over 300 million trees a year. I mean, I have to wrap my brain around that one. So there was some fires that also would rage in droughts and stuff from lightning. So this is we see a lot of descriptions of Western Pennsylvania areas where Native Americans lived, and this is one that I took from the historical record, where Europeans talk that it was extremely open underneath these large, mostly white oaks and park-like due to the universal factor of fire, right? So you would have gone to Beechwood while you would have seen diversity of other trees. You would have seen a massive forest of very, very large trees dominated by white oak, right? With probably sparse understory there. You could walk through it relatively easy. There would have been in spring just literally tons of trilliums and Dutchman's breeches and bloodroot and Mayapples spread across everywhere in a very high diversity because deer were substantially less than they are today. And that's also an impact of Native American hunting and gathering resources, right? So, white-tailed deer, their three main predators that kept them in check were wolves, panthers, or mountain lions, and Native Americans, humans, right? So their density was substantially less. We have evidence of human interactions at Beechwood from Native Americans at this time. And again, this predates the historical period long before 300 years ago. There's all sorts. I've found flint chips. I've found what was once part of a scraper that could be 4,000 years old. But there was definitely during the historic period when George Washington was going through Western PA in 1753 and went to what is now Lawrenceville. It was called Shanapinstown at that time. I guarantee you that there were Native Americans hunting in what is now Beechwood. So you would have found Native Americans hunting white-tailed deer and other animals through there. And we know Dorseyville Road was, in fact, an Indian trail. So there were definitely Native Americans often traversing, hunting, gathering, camping, doing all those things, right? We've already talked about a little bit of fire. I'll skip that next one here. But yeah, fire was a really important part of Native Americans in Western Pennsylvania in the East in sort of managing their landscapes, right? And we are slowly starting to bring that back. Where I live here in Butler, they're beginning to burn game lands and potentially here soon parts of Moraine State Park. And when people first heard that, they were going, oh my gosh, that's terrible, right? The results have been nothing short of amazing. There's what's called a burn master, which I think is the greatest name for a job. Can you imagine going to a party and tell someone that your job is a burn master? You set the landscape on fire for a living. Um, it kills off invasive species. It brings the oaks primarily back. Deer and other animals absolutely love that habitat. So it's been a really interesting thing to see here. We know, and this beach would be part of this, that the historical fire regime was on an order of about 100 to 400 years, sometimes greater, sometimes less than that, right? Cook's Forest, those massive hemlocks there, were seedlings after a massive fire that went through in the 1640s. And there, we now believe it was most likely the Seneca Indians that set the fire initially. We can't prove it, but they lived in that area that caused the whatever forest type was there before to die. And then those current trees that you see there begin to grow, right? Which is amazing to think that those trees were seedlings when Pennsylvania didn't even exist, which I think is fascinating to me, right? Um, so again, this fire regime probably was a result of Native Americans long before these refugee Native Americans began to settle this region again in the 1720s. This is a huge part of understanding also why the landscape seemed to be so much more lush and filled with animals and stuff like that is because, again, for a long period of time before these refugees came, there was no humans here hunting them. Native Americans had a huge impact on local mammal populations, right? And the biggest part of Native Americans' interactions with the land from the 1720s to the 1780s were what was called the fur trade. The women were the farmers, the men were hunters and warriors. And through most of the year, their main job was to go out there and hunt white-tailed deer and trap beavers and other fur-bearing animals, which became their mode of currency, essentially, right? So from 300 years ago until now, let's say another 50, 60 years, you would have seen every year less and less white-tailed deer. You would have seen less and less beaver would have disappeared by the 1750s, 1760s at the latest. You would have seen bears and wolves increase because both of them, particularly wolves, they would eat a lot of the carcasses of the white-tailed deer and other animals left by the Native Americans. So you would have seen actually more wolves, more bears, but substantially less white-tailed deer. And by the 1780s, they were really, really becoming scarce in Western Pennsylvania, which is hard for us in the modern time to imagine, right? Because there are more white-tailed deer now than there's ever been ever, right? So it had a way of really changing what our particular ecosystem was there, right? So really, until about the 1780s, you would have probably seen every spring and summer just an absolute lush forest filled with every single type of native plant and spring ephemeral because deer began to disappear. So just to give you some visuals of what beechwood may have, and again, this is taking pictures of other what we consider today old growth forests, right? So this is just to give you a visual imagining of what beechwood would have liked. And this is one that you would have found in the lower land areas where you start to see the hemlock. You can see in there our state tree beginning to dominate with some larger ones that like that shaded area. If you drive around Route 8 today, you can still see Pine Creek and North Park, right? Um, Pine Creek went right by my house too. Remnants of the hemlocks that once dominated that creek area, and Beechwood is part of that um, drainage system that goes to the Allegheny River. So you would have seen pretty large and small hemlock trees just like this. But this is primarily what you would have noticed here. You would see this is a massive white oak tree that you see there in the middle. You could see some other species in the background that are mixed within it. There's some red or black oak to the left. You can see some other things that look like tulip tree. I see some other hemlock in there, but notice the understory is much more open. There is some brush in the past. You would have found that. Most likely spice bush. Dogwood was also a very huge part of the understory here. I'd be willing to bet in spring, like April and May, in 300 years ago, we would have been like, wow, how beautiful is that to see like literally hundreds of flowering dogwoods flowering at once. A lot of the Europeans that came here in Western Pennsylvania, wrote that down, and these people aren't biologists. It was something that was very striking to them, and hence why the Ohio was called the Beautiful River, right? It was just must have been an amazing thing to experience to see how that looked. So this just gives you a visual with a white oak dominated forest there. This is what beechwood is named after. These are the beeches, right, that also would have been found, and this is very typical of a mature beech forest. Beech are very long-lived trees, just like oaks. They tend to cluster around each other. You can see some of the smaller one that sprouted when the roots were open and is getting crushed by its mother. I think it's the root embrace that coming out there. A very important tree for a species of bird that is now extinct, the passenger pigeon. You can almost, I would essentially, I would lay a lot of money down that at some points passenger pigeons would have descended upon beechwood, eating the beech nuts that would have been found amassed at various parts of the property, right? So it would have been a really, really interesting thing to see and experience. And as I mentioned, right, things like trillium of all sorts of different types, right? Snow trillium, white trillium, burgundy, you name it, would have been all in the understory in spring. So it would have been so cool to see just the forest floor blanketed with all these various spring wildflowers and ephemerals. So we don't really get today because of too many white-tailed deer and invasive species and other habitat changes in the past 300 years. So by the 1780s, Native Americans are being really essentially forced out of the area. I would be willing to bet the last Native Americans that traversed um, Beechwood's property probably was at the very end of the American Revolution in 1781. Would probably see the very last, though it could have been earlier than that. After the American Revolution ends, and I'm not going to get into the history here, there's a good 13 years where things are still not so great for European and now American settlers coming into this area. A battle that was decisive in what is now Western Ohio called the Battle of Fallen Timbers forever ends Native Americans essentially, impacting anything here in Western PA. And you see the folks that a lot of them that fought in the American Revolution absolutely flood into what is now Beechwood and Fox Chapel and pretty much Hampton and all of Western Pennsylvania to take advantage of this land that is now open to settlement. And almost the first thing these people would have done would have been clearing these mass forests. It is very fascinating to think and read the few that exist, their accounts of how terrified they were of these massive forests. They call them deserts, which I think is really interesting from their mindset. Because remember, in Europe at this time, all of the forests had been practically cleared by this, and they lived in patchwork of grasslands, right? So these massive forests that they would have been encountering really, really scared them. So that was one of the first things they did is a very quick and massive clearing of these forests. And almost in that very first year of settling the land, they would fence off those fields because their horses and cattle, they would just turn loose into the forest to forage for themselves, but they needed to, if they're growing corn and other things, they need to start dividing that up. Why does that matter? Well, when you start isolating parts of the landscape from other animals and you segment it, right, and fragment it, that really greatly impacts this ecosystem that you find there. By these large mammals that existed for long periods of time, and especially came back after the depopulation of people here in the 1640s, large mammals that had existed for thousands of years, like deer and bears and wolves and panthers, right, and otters and beaver, were all essentially exterminated by the 1820s, at the latest by the 1840s. So by the 1820s, most likely, you would have never seen any of these large mammals at Beechwood. They would have been completely gone. So think about that, right? So let's say at the latest, deer, white-tailed deer, are gone from Beechwood forever in the 1840s. You now have over 100 plus years where deer and deer browsing are going to have no impact on the landscape here, right? But what changed is literally overnight and rapidly are these new open fields of grass and cereal crops that begin to dominate the landscape that was once forest, right? On top of that, when I mean cereal crops, right, wheat and rye and barley and oats, right? But along with those, in so often they say infected in those are European or Eurasian weeds like dandelions and the various mustards like garlic mustard, which you still find there at Beechwood, same thing with dandelions. The plantains, which Native Americans called that the Englishman's foot, because they were noticing the landscape and their ecosystems changing as the English and the later Americans were settling further and further west. Things like chicories, which are in bloom right now, and docks and clovers, all of these things start to now settle and essentially transform Beechwood into this alien landscape. It's like aliens have landed from somewhere else and have now completely altered the land from what humans had really known for thousands of years, right? You also get new old world insects like honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America. Europeans brought them over. And I always think about this. Can you imagine the person or persons that their job was to babysit and nurse honeybees for 2 months, go crossing the Atlantic Ocean? Can you imagine what a crazy job that would have been? I was teaching in the spring about that, thinking about that. That would have been a really hard job, and probably you would be stung a fair amount, I would imagine. Other things like the Hessian fly, which was a really bad um, pest to wheat. But I'm not sure how many of you know this. Earthworms in Western PA are not native. Earthworms were brought over in ship ballast from Europe. Our earthworms in this area were all killed off in the last ice age. So every earthworm, right, including the Japanese jumping worms that you see today, were brought from somewhere else, and they have massive impacts on the landscape. You wouldn't think an earthworm would, right? But they turn over the leaf litter and the plant material much, much faster than you would have seen back then, right? Replacing these large native mammals like deer and bears and wolves, you see Eurasian species like cattle and oxen and horses, right? Which ironically enough horses evolved in North America. But then animals like pigs and sheep and goats replace these former large mammals. So it's essentially taking the ecosystem of Europe and trying to replicate it here at Beechwood. The changes would have been fast, they would have been quick, and they would have had massive impacts to our native species here, right? What was the settlement like? Well, we know starting about the 1790s, maybe the turn of the 19th century, like 1800, there was at least 9 different houses in the property and several barns that existed for various times that now incorporates what we call Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve, so the 134 acres. And I've already mentioned this, right? The clearing would have begun probably late 1790s, early 1800s. During the Civil War, there was a double log house and log barn existing, right, on the property, probably where the current house and store is at Beechwood. There's very, very detailed evidence of grain and maize and animal husbandry from this time. I can still find various sandstone rocks on the property if you look hard enough that have plow scars from plows hitting them. The forest, so if you go down Spring Hollow past the pond, that forest has probably been cut at least twice, but most likely maybe more. None of those trees, and there's some pretty large ones down there, and there was one that unfortunately was a witness tree that recently died in the last 5 or 6 years near the pond. None of those trees were here when the first Europeans arrived and began settling it. So all of those oaks and the tulip trees and some of the other very large ones in Spring Hollow Trail and some other areas are relatively recent. We think the oldest ones are probably started growing just before the American Civil War around that time, right? So 1820s, we think that white oak that was down near the pond that died, that was probably our best guess, and that's probably being very, very generous. That was probably the oldest of the trees on there. What's interesting to me, and this is where sort of the history and archaeological, I said, I don't know how many of you know this, but there are 2 earthen dams hiding on the reserve. So that means sometime, and we think at least one of them in the 19th century, someone created these I mean, they are huge earth dams for one of 2 reasons. One, it was probably a pond to help livestock because it's and would have been at that time a relatively wooded area, right? Even though it would have been cleared out. And a lot of people don't understand why. They say, well, why would farmers for dairy especially leave a little bit of islands of forest? Well, a day like today when it's so hot, I know a lot of you probably are really up to date on modern dairying, but when the cows, when they are very, very warm, they do not produce milk at the same level that they do. And if they get really hot, yeah, they don't produce any milk, right? So they would go into the forest to cool off and get into the shade and drink water. So that's possible. I think the one that you find on Spring Hollow also may have been actually like a retention pond to deal with stormwater because the trail that leads past, so it comes down from our parking lot, and I'll show you a picture here in a bit, that comes past that was once Hart's Run Road. And so that may also be a very old way of trying to control water issues on the road, but we don't know for sure. But unless you're looking for it, you would never really notice that. But you can imagine, right? That was a big change. It caused a substantial amount of erosion that you can still see there. So those types of impacts by humans were big, and they still resonate today. So 100 years later, right, by the 1890s, the land would have been almost completely cleared of any forest, the small little patch that existed in Spring Hollow, and was a mixture of grain crops, corn, right, or maize, probably some fruit trees, and then mass amounts of hay fields. I suspect for most of what is now Beechwood's history during the 19th century was probably used for hay. Again, what did they use? I mean, white oak was cut very rapidly because it's great to split and make boards for homes, and firewood. Chestnut that they cut was used for boards and fences. Black oak they used for making, and red oaks for cooperage barrels and all sorts of other things. Hickories is really good for firewood. Remember, a lot of the forest was cut to make wood, firewood for winters, right? All of that would have been also, including the woods themselves, would have been grazed intensely by livestock. There was a disease that used to impact people called milk sickness. I don't know, some of you have heard me say this on my walks before, but milk sickness is when cows would be grazing in forests and eat today what we call snake root. And the alkali would accumulate in their milk. And when humans would drink the milk, they would die a pretty agonizing death as a result. So a lot of farmers at this time, before they had really extensive fields, would try to kill off as much snake root as they could. Milk sickness killed Abraham Lincoln's mother as well, but that was a common problem back then. So just to give you some visuals here, right? You can see people clearing with oxen. They would girdle the trees, these massive trees. Obviously, they didn't have chainsaws and they weren't cutting them really, at least initially, with big saws. They just girdled, they killed the cambium around the trees, they would let them die. Next year, they would plant corn underneath it because the trees wouldn't have any leaves. As those trees fell down over time, they would burn them, or sometimes burn trees in situ. Um, so it would have been a really, really big operation. Every year for probably 30, 40 years after first settlement, the landscape around Beechwood and Western PA would have always smelled to a certain degree of wood smoke from all of this burning. So think about this, right? So from that very diverse white oak dominated mixed mesophytic forest, you get by the late 1880s, Beechwood in the landscape would have been radically and vastly transformed, right? So now by then, 20 years after the American Civil War, right when Pittsburgh is first starting to greatly industrialize with steel and Andrew Carnegie, Beechwood would have been a patchwork of fields, fences, and grasslands. This would have led to soil erosion every year from the plowing, right? And livestock, right? Instead of having relatively stable soil temperatures, now that the forest was gone, you would have much warmer soils in the summer and much colder soils in the winter, right? Because forests will actually regulate that. That impacts the types of plants that can grow in that as well. Things like ragweed. If you have allergies like me, boy, we're getting into ragweed season, right? And grasses. Ragweed is native, but now it would have dominated the landscape. You would see meadow plants, non-natives like yarrow and clovers, right? And forest diversity would have been completely stripped. The only really larger mammals you would have found at this time at Beechwood, right, would have been things like weasels and a few squirrels, probably chipmunks in a few spots, but it's hard to say for sure, right? But then rabbits, fox would have been not very common, but they could have been around, and then mice. So most mammals now, other than humans and then the livestock they have in dogs, would have been these smaller animals. What I think, and this is something if you like birds, you need to think about this. So grassland bird species that would not have been here, like barn swallows or whippoorwills or red-headed woodpeckers, horned larks, eastern meadowlarks, bobwhite. I hear all the time, where have all the bobwhite gone? And I said, well, they're going back to where they originally were because they wouldn't have been here prior to the clearing of these forests, right? And grasshopper and vesper sparrows. This landscape was now an extension of the Midwest savanna type habitats that you would have found in Indiana or further places westward, right? So we really, really altered the bird populations. You wouldn't have found pileated woodpeckers. You wouldn't have found things like wood thrush or scarlet tanagers or rose-breasted grosbeaks because none of that habitat that they once had was still there. So those interior forest bird species, right? were all gone. Obviously, passenger pigeons were extinct by 1916, but they probably hadn't been landing at Beechwood at any time in the previous 100 years. What also you would have noticed, you would have seen almost no birds of prey. Hawks and owls were hunted constantly. There was bounties put on them. So you would have seen almost no red tails, almost no red-shouldered hawks. Cooper's hawks would have greatly declined. They used to be called chicken hawks, right? Turkey vultures would be very rare. So it would have been a very, very interesting and different type of ecosystem. So this is what you would have seen. These are some of the trees that are girdled, and you can see corn. This is from the 1840s. No, it's later than that. Maybe the 60s. I don't remember exactly here. This is not Western PA, but this is the same type of thing you would have done. You would have seen the trees girdled, corn planted underneath until they fell, where they were burned in the wintertime, and then these fences, split rail fences, would have kept other animals out. Fencing completely changes how these ecosystems interacted with, right? You would have seen this wide open area. How many of you have ever hayed with a sigh, right? I'm sure you all were like, oh, yeah, that was a great childhood activity. Very few people hay anymore. I know one of you on here have a connection with that, but I've done it a few times with folks that, and actually one of them's a coworker here, but I've never done it with the size. So I can't imagine how much work that would have been. But this is, again, replicating the ecosystem and interaction with the landscape that would have been in Europe. Very different than how the Native Americans. I could see yarrow in here. You could see all this. This is essentially fodder for um, various livestock, right? Let's get to now. Let's move forward to where our namesake finally gets its name, and I would say some of the biggest impacts on the land for really only about 45 years, but it had a massive impact, and that's where we get our names today, and that's Beechwood Farms. So in 1903, Senator William Flynn, right, buys the property that is now Beechwood. And him and some other wealthy folks, they didn't want to be with the poor plebeians that you found in O'Hara or Indiana. So they carve out this really convoluted place that they call Fox Chapel because they didn't want to coexist with those folks, right? But Senator William Flynn, who is massively wealthy, um, and you have to just be honest, he was a contractor with McGee. So you've heard McGee Hospital. And essentially, you would say he was a shyster because magically all of the contracts for city bridges and buildings had this certain color put into the contract that only William Flynn's family had that particular stone quarry. So it's amazing how that happens, right? So he became very, very wealthy and he retires from politics and buys the property in August of 1903, right? His main purpose, he was a gentleman farmer, right? So he had plenty of money. He's not doing this to make lots of money, but he wants it to exist as a farm. And from the very get-go until the very end, dairy was the main focus of Beechwood Farms. And that's because by this point in time, right, we see Pittsburgh's in the, throes of industrialization. Milk was in very, very high demand, and dairy had now become the main focus of a lot of farms here in Western Pennsylvania. Fields were what were we say were on a five crop rotation, right? So you would go, one of those would be fallow with hay and clover and various things. Then you would have corn, you'd have wheat, you would have rye or oats, and I think the other one was maybe barley. I can't remember off the top of my head. But they really focused on 70 prized winning Guernsey cattle that for roughly 45 years grazed the property. So that first picture that I showed you where all of the meadow is today, you would have seen starting in the early turn of the 20th century, Guernsey cattle shipped from the island of Guernsey in Jersey in what is now England over to the property, right? And that would have been the main one because they produce really, really good milk, high quality cream. The farm also raised ducks. They had chickens, Flemish giant rabbits, Belgian draft horses, which you'll see that they used all the way almost into 1950. And then for a while, prize-winning German Shepherd police dogs were raised on the property as well. they had a very large greenhouse, and William and then his son Richard and their wives were really interested in growing a lot of things like carnations and roses, cut flowers. That was a big business at the time. Things like poinsettias around Christmas, right? We know were grown there. As I prefaced it in the very beginning, is tomatoes were grown in a large scale along this greenhouse. You're going to see a picture of that. So during World War One and all the way up to World War Two, there was a cannery on the site where they canned them and actually supported the war effort. So on those lonely, muddy, cold trenches in Flanders somewhere could have been Beechwood tomatoes that an American soldier opened up, back when the First World War went on. We especially know Richard Flynn. He loved silver maples, and they were planted along the creamery in the barn, which now is where our parking lot sits. And you can see the legacy of those because we still have very large silver maples on the property that was planted by either William or Richard Flynn, that or their descendants that have now growing on there. That's all done on purpose, right? So silver maples are a big part of when you see the opening uh, parts of our trails there at Beechwood, and that is because of the Flynns. His son Ralph and then Richard run the farm from 1924 to 1949. They had built down near the pond 5 houses for farm workers on both sides of what was then Old Harts Run Road, right, which is now our main trail that runs down from our parking lot by the plant center. And a sixth one for married farm workers was added in 1935, right? The house where our office is and nature store is, that was for unmarried bachelors. That's where they lived who worked on the farm, right? But there were a number of houses, and you can still find the remnants of the foundations, and they're various living up there. I always do with kids sometimes a little bit of archaeology, so it's interesting to see that. Workers made $2 a day and received free milk from the farm. Near the pond and up the hill, what is now called Toddler Trail and Oak Forest, that was a common garden area. So they had all sorts of cabbages and other garden crops that the families grew. The present silver maples, when you go down along Spring Hollow Trail near the pond, they were planted in the 1920s, right, along some of the front parts of the front yards of those houses. They're huge trees. I know some of you know what I'm talking about, but that was the front yards of these farm worker houses. I still find bits of broken pottery. I have found kids' marbles, cars. So it's really cool for at least me to connect that to the lives of the people that live there. Pine Hollow, which is in the further back part of the property, that was planted in during the Great Depression in the 1930s. We've heard from people that had connections from the families that lived there when things weren't going so well when the economy crashed. That Pine Hollow pines were planted by the workers just to keep them busy and employed. So that's the only reason why those trees are there in the back. I absolutely love this picture. This is Beechwood Farms in the 1920s. So this is roughly a picture from 100 years ago. And if you look at it right, it is extremely different from what we find today. 100 years might seem a lot to us because our lifespans, that is a mere blink of the eye when it comes to um, really ecosystems and landscapes, right? I mean, but you see here right away when you're looking here at Beechwood and some of the properties across there is that there's very few trees for a forest, and what trees you do see mostly there are fruit trees for people to consume. I see apple trees there. There are there's fruit trees in the lower bottom, so mostly apples, but there was pears, peaches, plums, cherries. Where you see that big greenhouse, okay, everybody see that sort of in the very middle of the picture. You'll see the greenhouse. That is today exactly where the education building sits. And for 30 plus years, they grew carnations and rose and poinsettia built that you can see there. And that's where that building connected to where they powered it with a coal furnace is where the Raptor Center sits today. You go in the periphery of that, where that thing is, you still find huge amounts of coal littered around there because they must have really just been shoveling that coal in there. Right behind the greenhouse that you see there where the ed building sits is the main house, our offices and store there at Beechwood. And that's the only building that still exists from the original Beechwood Farms. You can see a barn. The silo is actually kind of hidden there in the back where the animals lived, and there is a creamery that sits right where our parking lot is today. And there was another building in the very front there at Beechwood, which I am not 100% sure what that is. But if you look down, so you can see some smaller outcrop buildings where sheep and goats and ducks and chickens lived, and the cows lived, obviously in the barn. And then below, where the education building, below that greenhouse, you see a building that we don't know exactly what that is for. And I still find bits of foundation. That is now where you start to go up the hill to the top of Upper Meadows Trail there. But it's cool if you look to the right below the greenhouse, you can see that's all sorts of what I can pretty much best I can guess is mostly tomatoes, but it looks like there's probably cabbages and other things growing in there as well. So very, very different, right? You would have found at this time, if I go in this picture, things like barn swallows, English house sparrows. Starlings probably had just begun to arrive. You wouldn't have found very many, but starlings may have just begun. You would have found pigeons, right? You would have found all sorts of grassland birds like bobwhites. Turkeys would have been completely gone, right? You would have found birds like meadowlarks and horned larks. So it was a very, very vastly different landscape from what it would have been 100 years before this, and then, of course, from what it is today. But I love looking at this because this just shows, we're just a blink of the eye when it comes to the landscape here. This is up on the hill, what is today we call Jim Rohr's driveway. It's technically not a trail, but it goes, that's where there's a house back there. This is from, again, the same time period, looking towards the greenhouse where the Ed building is. And you can see the main house where the bachelors lived. You can see all the other outbuildings. But notice, right? Again, no trees, right? There's a few trees starting to grow in the front where would start planting those silver maples. It's hard to see from here, but almost no trees. This is not a great picture, and I apologize, but this is an aerial photograph of Beechwood from 1936 or 37. It's hard to see here. So you see where it says Ralph E. Flynn, and there's like a little circle carved out. This is what we call Jim Rohr's driveway, and Jim Rohr's house sits at the top there. There was an apple orchard over there, and I still find remnants of apple trees that are the descendants of that. But notice how this is just completely open with no trees, essentially all fields. You can see some what looks like hay fields. But as you get closer to Beechwood there, and at least in my view, it's obscured here by my screen, you can see the main complex of Beechwood sits right below that orange part where they carved out Fox Chapel from, and that's where the all these outbuildings and the barn and everything else was. To the bottom and to the left, that is a giant orchard of various fruit trees that you'll see a picture here in a second. There's Mr. William Flynn. He was close allies with Teddy Roosevelt. I would say he's a corrupt politician, but saying corrupt and politician is kind of redundant. But yeah, he's an interesting guy. I find most likely evidence from his son, but even during Prohibition, they were still enjoying some very high-end champagne because I find the bottles on the property. Um, so yeah, this is the gentleman that named Beechwood Farms, right? Here's his son, Ralph, looking over some of the sheep and some of those outbuildings. This would have been where the Discover Ground is today. Okay. There is one of their prized Guernsey cows. And it's amazing when I went through some of the archives that we had of pictures. I mean, that's all they did. And again, I don't know if it was because they wanted, most likely, probably they would take them. I think I found evidence in Pittsburgh, they would take them to livestock. Um, they would sell them at livestock auctions, but they also were really interested in breeding them, having other folks that were interested in dairy, high-end cream, which Guernseys are known for. Um, so again, you could see they love there's tons and tons of pictures of these Guernsey cows that would have been gracing the landscape of Beechwood for a long period of time. Here's one of those bachelor men gentlemen. This is again just below the barn, and another gentleman working there on the top, and they are just sort of managing the herd. They would go in and out, and those folks would bring them back to the barn. This is again just below today where the Discover Ground is, where all of our campers were running and screaming today. You could see this is the hillside today, which this is completely forest covered, but you notice no trees there whatsoever. Completely gone, any trees. And the ducks that would have been sold in local markets being um, sort of herded back down to one of their buildings. They would put them out during the day and then kind of herd them back. But again, this type, I mean, just it's hard for me to imagine hearing meadowlarks singing at Beechwood, right? Or vesper or grasshopper sparrows, right? I mean, it's pretty cool to see. This is a gentleman feeding. This is in the back part of Beechwood, so this is now all forest as well. They had chickens back there, but you could see, I recognize right in front there an apple tree. Some of the others, it's harder to say. They may be apples or peaches or, you know, plums potentially there, right? So you can see though some of the looks like ragweed actually in there, and it could be this time of year. It looks like a relatively hot day. Behind this gentleman are a few remnant white oaks that you can see just by that shape there in the back. So the last legacy of what the forest, was before it was cleared. This is up also on the hill with those Belgian draft horses doing some haying there, looks like on the hillside. And I love, again, I'm a historian, right? So I have to put the human faces behind the people that lived and interacted on the landscape that still impacts us to this day, right? There's a couple faces that you see pretty often here, a lot of these old pictures here. But I always think to myself, what if we could bring these folks? This is from exactly almost 100 years ago. I believe this was taken in 1925. Can you imagine if we bring these gentlemen? I love you farm worker with a tie, right? Or a bow tie. That would have been fun work working in a suit and tie on in a day like this. Um, but bring them to where Beechwood is today and show them what it looks like. And I always imagine, or go back 100 years and the first settlers or Native Americans 200 years before that, right? So keep that in context. When you see Beechwood today, you may be here, but I won't be here 100 years into the future. What will it be like? What will our landscape at Beechwood be like? How much changes? But those faces experience the Beechwood that is very, very different from what you and I experience today. Here they are they had Beechwood, they were proud of this, had one of the first trucks in Pittsburgh for farms to deliver their high-end cream to like the Duquesne Club and all of these high-end places across Western Pennsylvania. Here you can see a gentleman there picking up right outside the creamery. You can see the silo that once existed there for silage. And yeah, it was our address was Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, but he's loading up all of that high-end cream to be delivered across Western PA. These are some of the cream bottles from those Guernsey cattle that we have found and unearthed at various parts of Beechwood. These are actually, believe it or not, these are worth money out on the market. We just keep them for the historical context. This is right behind my office at Beechwood, but these are the golden Guernsey milk, right? And then there's the creams. Guernseys are well known for producing really good creams. And they also Beechwood would private label some of their lower end creams. This is a Harmony. This is a very common one. This is what they gave to the farm workers because one of the spots there at Beechwood we found where they dumped their garbage before there was obviously garbage services, and it's really telling to see. They had this private labeled the lower end milk and cream. They also, this is going to shock you, right? Being working class men, they really like their Iron City beer. I cannot tell you how many Iron City beer bottles that I found back there from the 1930s. I mean, it is just, they had a taste for Iron City beer. So, there you go. Beechwood Farms' legacy on ecosystems, right? All this intensive grazing and plowing led to soil erosion, leaching, and then later invasive plants, right? And today, things like curly and burdock exist, all the various mustards. We don't just have garlic mustard, but we have a whole host of others. Non-native grass, right, are still found because of this. But this is where we begin to get the first invasives taking over landscape, especially as the farm starts to you know, fall apart after Richard, or excuse me, William, and then Ralph Flynn, he was also called Richard, um, starts to tail off in the 1940s. And things like privet and bush and vining honeysuckle and bittersweet and buckthorn begin to spread starting probably in the 30s, but really 40s and 50s start to overtake the landscape. The first white-tailed deer most likely start to arrive in the 50s, but you really seeing them regularly would have been the 1960s and 70s, right? As a result, once the farm is abandoned, right after World War II, you see regeneration of the forest that leads to younger forests now dominated by light intolerant and fast growing trees. And you can still see this there today. So black cherry, aspen, right? Quaking aspen and red maple are three trees that now mostly are found at Beechwood. And then you will also still have continuing silver maples and their descendants growing in multiple places at Beechwood. And also Norway maples were also brought in for farm plantings at this time. I have zero idea why they brought in Norway maples to plant when we have perfectly good maples to begin with. And I mean, I don't mean that derisively. I just don't understand why they did that. Okay. But let's get to now, and this is my last few slides here, and I'll open it to questions. So once the farm ends, and we see Beechwood Farms itself ending in the early 50s. They start to tear down most of those agricultural buildings. They leave the house and a few other, what we today still have. It's called Dorothy's Shed. That's the only other structure that exists from the farm. The land slowly recovers from this intensive agriculture, and then these new ecosystems begin to emerge that we find today. The year I was born, 1976, Josh and Farley Wetzel owned the property and handed it over to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and of course named it after what it was, Beechwood Farms. And then in February 1977, it was announced that Audubon ASWP would run Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve. It would be our headquarters. And Bill Edgar became the first director, and Charles Beer, who just retired from WPC, the first teacher naturalist, right? So I like to say I am in their footsteps. They started everything, right? And it officially opens in September 1977. This is after the Flynns leave. This is the 60s. The house and everything around gets really, really run down. You can see the remnant silver maples, but man, there's a lot of garbage. This might even be where that one plow that I was showing you from originated here. This is our nature store today and where our offices are. So this is from, again, the early 60s. It's just a sort of a rundown mess. Apparently they put something plastic over the window that seems like it's not working too well. Yeah, this is what it looked like, right? This is looking from that same Roars Highway in the mid 60s down into, again, where the main house is. You can see what was extensive grasslands now starting. There's some larger trees that are probably very big trees of beechwood just beginning. No more grazing, so you start to get, you're not having hay cut. So a lot of plants that are early succession plants like goldenrod and blackberry and black raspberry start to move in. But these trees that you see growing there are mostly black cherry and red maple. So Beechwood Farms, 1980 to present. So it is now today a managed landscape with nature trails, mowed. Well, though we haven't mowed it in a while, we're doing a little bit different type of management to it and restored forest land. Even when Beechwood was running as a nature reserve, I don't know how many of you know this, there was still coal mining going on underneath the property. So it was still continuing until the late 70s. The barn there, called Evans Nature Center, that's connected with the house, um, it did not pre-exist and go back. I get this question all the time to the Flynn's. It was constructed in 1979. So that's where it was begun. And then the pond, which was a wet meadow where they love to have the Guernsey cattle graze because that's where all the best um, forage and grazing was. The pond then is created and dammed up that little spring in 1980. There was then apple tree plantings that are still growing around the property, starting in the early 80s. I have gentleman that goes on my Wednesday walks that told me he was one of the people that planted there, and I asked him why, and he says, I don't know. I have no idea why we planted those. There was a Native American garden in the early 80s. Interesting enough, when they built 279, there was a massive plant rescue that a lot of the plants that we propagated and planted, repopulated on Beechwood, like snow trillium and other plants that I'm not going to mention because they're extremely rare, are now found at Beechwood from this plant rescue. The education building where my office is was the first green building built in Western Pennsylvania in 1989 on top of the old foundation of the greenhouse that was there. 25 years ago, we opened up the Audubon Center for Native Plants. I was just graduating college at the time, but it's been there for 25 years. And then today it is now 134 acres, right? What are the more recent impacts? Well, rise of deer. Deer are just, again, it's not deer's fault, but it's a human created problem. Deer disappeared for 100 years, and now there's more deer now than there's ever been ever. So a lot of the problems that we see with invasive species, because deer don't eat them, and the destruction of spring ephemerals are because there's too many deer, right? Dutch elm disease removed most of our elms that began to grow. Gypsy moths, right, are now called spongy moth, killed a lot of the oaks. You can still find them laying along the forest floor. So now most of our forest is a young forest dominated once again by red maple and black cherry, which would not have been the case 300 years ago. Formerly common bird species like ring-necked pheasant, completely gone. Bobwhite, completely gone. Ruffed grouse, completely gone, right? However, species that may have been gone for 200 years or 150 years, like wild turkey and pileated woodpeckers and Cooper's hawks and red-shouldered hawks are found in abundance on the property. This is 1980, so this is what we look like just 3 years after. This is the current meadow there that we decided to not turn into forest and manage it. But you can see how small the forest is in 1980 going up that hillside where you can see some of the trails through there. So it's amazing how quickly nature wants to take over and reforest it, right? Here was once, I don't know if any of you know this, there was a Native American garden, but I still find plantings from that as well. Here's our Native Plant Center. I'm there a lot, and maybe some of you are connected with that. We do a lot of great stuff there. And this is what I often deal with this time of the year, right? Now kids are constantly on our property in the summer, right? Doing nature summer camps, getting them outside where they belong, off of screens and interacting and seeing how the land, but they, and like most people, have no idea how much has changed in 300 years, right? Um, Real quick, because we're running out of time here. Some of the most recent problems here, we've seen invasives like emerald ash borer wipe out all the ash. We have issues with oak wilt, amongst others. Woolly adelgid is killing our hemlocks, but few exist on the property, especially next to the plant center. We've had stink bugs and Japanese jumping worm, now spotted lanternfly, right? Stilt grass, knotweed, tree of heaven, all are major problems. So we have a management plan, and it's actually, again, it is a Herculean task, but it is definitely having positive impacts. And I think about the future, right? How much are humans going to impact it both on the ground and in the air? So climate change in the future all have big things. Really quickly here, because I know I'm taking up a lot of time and I like this stuff so much that I could probably talk to you for 3 hours about this. If you ever go to Beechwood, you may see these stairs, these concrete stairs that still exist. It's extremely rickety. I have no idea why they're still there, but these are the stairs that led right into the creamery when Beechwood Farms were there. So for some reason, we decided to leave them, but it borders what used to be the old Harts Run Road. Like I told you, I have kids going down there when we do summer camp, and they're inevitably going, Mr. Chris, I found this sharp bottle with glass. What, and there's a garbage dump. So very carefully had them do a little bit of archaeology, but you can see, yes, they you know were using a lot of things. You could see they canned a lot of stuff, so it was pretty cool to see these, just again showing the legacy of humans on Beechwood. This is the old Hearts Run Road, which is our main trail that heads down. And these houses that I was talking about for the farm were to the right of this up on the hill and also to the left of this. And you could see some of the trees that were planted. Silver maple planted by the Flynns going back to the 1920s. All right, here's the beginning. We put our ADA trail in a few years back, leading into the meadow. Also the start with our chimney swifts there. And this is my last slide. Yes, there's peacocks that roam Beechwood. This is one that I took in the back office. Someone nearby has a peacock that will show up at our bird feeders right behind the education building. So again, imagine Native Americans 300 years ago, or those farmers 100 years ago, imagining seeing a peacock. So who knows, in 100 years, maybe there'll be elephants and giraffes roaming Beechwood. I have no idea, but it's just fascinating to think just the flora and fauna that we experience today has been just so greatly impacted by humans interacting on the landscape there at Beechwood the past 300 years.